When Senator Richard Pan's bill was being discussed in Sacramento, a lot of angry opponents showed up. Their ranks included both parents and pediatricians. We're joined now by two of the physicians who were there in attendance. Dr. Edmond Sarraf and Dr. Shira Miller are members of a group called Physicians for Informed Consent, and they join me now here in studio. And thank you for taking the time. And Dr. Miller, I want to start with you, and just so our viewers have a very clear sense, because for many years, the bulk of the conversation around vaccines had to do with this notion that some people had, that vaccines caused autism. That was based on research that is now widely been discredited. And I just want to make sure people know it's not as if you are objecting to vaccines because you believe they cause autism.
Right. So our group, we have hundreds of doctors, and they all have different types of recommendations about vaccines. There isn't one schedule, and they follow specific recommendations that they're comfortable with based on individual patients. So every patient is an individual. And our organization, we're a nonprofit organization of doctors and scientists, and we united in order to safeguard informed consent and vaccination. And what that means really is that we are trying to we're trying to protect patients from losing their right to refuse either one or more vaccines, just like any other medical treatment.
But this new legislation was designed around the fact that, according to Dr. Pan, there were people who were claiming the medical exemption who maybe did not actually merit it. So Dr. Sarraf, walk me through, if I'm a family and I come into your office with kids, what is that conversation like about whether or not they should have the vaccine for measles and whether or not their kids are genuinely medically exempt from it?
Absolutely. So, we look at every individual, very, very specifically for who they are. Our genetics are not all the same. I may give an antibiotic to one child to treat pneumonia, and another child I may put in the hospital. So when it comes to vaccines, is really we need to understand, who may or may not have a reaction to it. And we look at the family history of individuals, the autoimmune disease, neurological disease, allergic disorders, GI disorders. We look at family history if someone had a vaccine reaction. Unfortunately, at this moment in time, we don't have one specific test to say, okay, we will test this and we know exactly who should or should not be exempt. But we really, Alex, we don't have an exemption problem. Look at the total number of exemptions that we have. We're talking about less than 1% of the population. At this moment, the medical exemption rate is 0.7%. So when we talk about MMR vaccines or the measles epidemic and all that, this bill has really trying to decrease this 0.7% to what? To 0.3?
I'm not quite sure about what number you're talking about there, but I do know that the numbers that Dr. Pan and others have given out and their concerns for this, which we all, and again, I think this is just one of those things that the scientific community agrees upon, is that we don't eradicate or eliminate measles without herd immunity, and you need it to be at 95%. And what we've seen is that some of those, that a number of schools throughout California, not all of them, but there are places where it's dipping below, and the concern is that, much like we used to hear about, medical marijuana, you just walk in and say, I get headaches, and you get a prescription, that maybe some families are taking advantage of this and saying that they need a medical exemption, where it really is more of a personal or philosophical belief. How do you weed out which is which is legitimate?
So really, let's analyze that. So are we really taking advantage of, the medical exemptions, which there's so few? The dialogue is constantly, all these schools are under-vaccinated. Yes, we've heard Dr. Pan and Dr. Fer mentioned 9%, 12%, 15%. There's very, very few schools. And the first question you have to ask, which one of those schools has ever spread, measles? Because that's the dialogue we hear constantly on TV. So there isn't any, that hasn't happened.
Well, we don't know because sometimes it takes a while, right? And as we've seen with the college campuses, that where we've got kids now who are of college age who grew up in an era where there was much more resistance. Sometimes you may not, get measles right in that moment of kindergarten, but you might later on. Maybe put this a different way: are there certain physical conditions that you feel like really merit a medical exemption, but it's not getting one within this piece of legislation?
Right, and so I want to talk about that and just present the context. So SB 277 that was passed in 2015, that basically banned parents from being able to protect their children from vaccine injuries and mandated that only medical doctors can do so, right? And so that was based on, and the doctors can only do it based on the medical circumstances of the child, including family history. And that family history is a very important part of the legislation, or it would not have passed, okay? So now SB 276 is attempting to ban those doctors who, since 277, they had to get educated and up to speed about the risk of vaccine injuries. They had to get educated because there was a big population.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you there because this is another one of those situations where I feel like I don't want to, because you could hear from families saying, you're banning my possibility of knowing I can send my kid to school safely because here's what we know about herd immunity. I'm asking about specific things and maybe interactions you've had with clients and patients where maybe the child isn't undergoing cancer treatment, but you feel strongly enough like a vaccination would really put a child at risk.
Alex, there's millions and millions of people right now in the United States who've had vaccine injury. Most doctors and most people don't know that there's a National Vaccine Act that has given $4 billion so far into vaccine injuries into people. Most people don't know that. And most people also don't know that there is no double-blind placebo studies to date. Most doctors don't know that, that there is no studies like that done. So how can we assess vaccine safety when the studies have never been done,
well, that's why I'm
which
asking,
is a standard of care?
That's why I'm asking for a personal example that you've seen where a parent has come to you and said, here's absolutely why I feel like there's a strong, it's not a personal, it's not religious, here's the medical reason why.
Let me talk about that.
Sure.
In our educational materials, specifically what's called the measles vaccine risk statement, that discusses specifically febrile seizures. And so there was a study 15 years ago in JAMA that was published that had almost 500,000 children. That study showed that if a child had febrile seizures before getting the MMR vaccine, their risk of getting a seizure after the MMR vaccine was 1 in 50. Now their sibling, their chance of getting a febrile seizure was 1 in 250, okay? And we know that febrile seizures, 5% of those febrile seizures go on to develop epilepsy, which is, a devastating chronic medical condition. So when we look at outbreaks in general, our focus at Physicians for Informed Consent is really to compare the risk of the disease versus the risk of the vaccine, right? And that's what we do with our educational materials. And so you have to look at the big picture, not just outbreaks, right? Because, for example, if you look at the outbreaks right now in California, right, since January, there's been 44 cases of measles.
45 in California now. There was a Berkeley one that just got diagnosed.
Okay. So most of those are in adults. 75% are in adults, not children who are saying that they're at.
But I'm going to jump in here for the sake of time because I want to get to an important point here. But I know that the medical community would say, look, if you go back and look, this is what measles could become. And you could also have kids dying because of encephalitis and damage to the brain. And this is the same vortex. I know you're familiar with all of the arguments here. My question is, in the time that we have left, this is one of those issues I feel like it's almost like national politics. And you could put someone who supports the current administration and someone who has huge problems with the current administration in a room, and they'll just kind of keep going back and forth and back and forth. I think the one thing that is different about this is that we can all agree no one wants to see a child hurt. No one wants to see a child suffer. No one wants to see a child sick. How do we get the different camps here to actually sit at the table and find some common ground? Because from what I'm hearing and seeing, we're a far cry from that place, regardless of what happens with this legislation.
Well, one of the beautiful things you're doing is you're trying to create balance in this conversation. There is no balance here. There's so much media focusing on outbreaks, which are not outbreaks. In 1964, before the vaccine came out, there was 4 million people, and there was about 450 deaths. If you look right now, we have 700. Let's say 1,000. Let's say 7,000. It's at this moment it's 700, but the fear associated with this measles outbreak is enormous. I have people calling from Russia, from South Africa, telling their kids, "Have your kids been vaccinated?" Look at the number of deaths that we've had. In 2015, we had one person. In 2003 was the last child who died, but that's not the feeling we get. We have 9 cases in LA, but yet the feeling is that, I have families that they want to leave their home. So we need to have the dialogue. We need to also protect some of the kids. I do have kids that come to my practice. They're not a lot. This is the vulnerable 1 to 2% that, we're trying to protect here. I have them come to the office. They say, "Listen, I listened everything to my doctor. We got, we went to our physical. We got some immunizations, and my child changed." And I went to my doctor and I told them my child changed. And the doctor said, "Well, no, that's not possible. Because us doctors, we don't know what we don't know. We don't know that there are not studies that show that there's no double-blind placebo. We just trust our institutions." So what we need to do if we want to, connect this divide is really have a conversation. Let's try to find out who are these people? How can we protect them so we don't put someone like Otto? When I was doing my SV276 speech, there was a little, Otto who got crippled by the DTaP vaccine. Let's not create that in order to bring the vaccine rate from 0.7% to 0.3%, for example.
Dr. Sarraf and Dr. Miller, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for making the time. We appreciate it. And just ahead, so much of the measles and vaccination discussion revolves around children, but there are plenty of questions about adults as well. We answer some of those when Inside the Issues returns.